My name is Scott Orr. I am the OmniSOC SOC Operations Manager. I'll talk more about me and my team in a moment. And I'm not really going to spend a lot of time really talking to you about the overview of OmniSOC. Certainly, you've heard this from numerous sessions over the last couple of days. But what I do kind of want to reiterate, even though it is, oops, hang on a second, I'm going too fast. Well, one thing I will say is, we currently do have the, some of the original Big Ten members are part of that. And we have since, if you went to the talk yesterday from the Research SOC, they have joined us as a partner. And as part of that partnership, we are now also directly supporting the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, the Gemini Observatory, and the Gauge Facility. And especially if you went to the last talk, you saw maybe several beautiful pictures of the Santa Clara University campus. They are the most recent folks to are joining us at the OmniSOC. Now, one thing I do kind of want to hit, and we were talked about both in the keynote yesterday, and if you had a chance to see my talk earlier this morning, was our goal. When the OmniSOC was formed, our overriding goal, which we are still working to stay completely true to, is that we want to minimize the time from the first awareness of a threat anywhere, and that's across any member that we support, to mitigation everywhere for all of our members. So we really look to kind of do whatever we can to take what we learn from one institution and apply that across the board. Now, to make that happen, we first need to get a lot of information from our members and put it into a facility that we can look at. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to CJ Kloote. CJ is the manager of our platform engineering team and the folks who really kind of build this wonderful infrastructure for us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, CJ.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So as Scott mentioned, I manage the platform engineering team at OmniSOC. So what do we do? We're responsible for collecting all this data from our members and putting it into a system that is available for the security engineers to use to do their work. So we're sort of a DevOps, like operations and software development team. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our infrastructure, how we run it, and how we collect this data and what we do with it. We'll start off with the basic systems architecture. So this is an on-prem deployed at the IU data center in Bloomington type of setup. We're not doing any kind of cloud hosting or anything like that. We're trying to keep everything sort of on-prem. IU has a very, very nice data center that was invested in years ago that makes sense for us to take advantage of. This is all just commodity Dell hardware running CentOS 7 operating system and using KVM virtualization on top of that. And then our entire infrastructure, we're doing automated provisioning across it with Foreman and Puppet. And then the underlying technology that powers the scene is the Elastic Stack, which we're managing and deploying with Ansible. And then monitoring the entire thing with Nagios, a pretty standard open source server health monitoring package with the alerts from that collected and fed into the IU Global NOC central monitoring system that they use to watch just about everything that the university does. So going in a little more detail on the infrastructure, today we have about 640 active hosts. That breaks down as about 140 physical servers running about 500 virtual machines. And these are all again, are in a few racks within the IU data center, but they are on a private isolated network. So most of these systems are not exposed in any way to the outside world. We have, a handful of dual homed machines that let us into the environment, let us get data into the environment, and then allow access to that data to security engineers to do their work, as well as some programmatic access for things that we do in an automated fashion. And we manage this whole thing in this DevOps infrastructure as code model, with the idea that we basically have a recipe for building all this stored in a private GitHub Enterprise instance. And we could use that to reconstitute the entire environment if needed. Like we have that, we have some key backups of some sort of key secrets that you need to reconstitute the environment. And if the whole, all the racks caught on fire, we could get more hardware and regenerate the whole thing without too much difficulty. So the kind of going into yet still more detail about how we run this. So we start using Puppet, which is a pretty common configuration management system used in the Linux world. It handles the base build of the operating system. So like all the things that are common across all the environments, what packages do we install on every machine, that kind of stuff. What specific version of CentOS 7 is our deployment standard? And so every time we turn up a new host, the first thing it gets on it is a Puppet agent that then configures it to our standard and then periodically updates it as that standard changes. We also use Ansible, which is another sort of sometimes considered a competing configuration management tool to Puppet, but we use them both because we feel they have different strengths and weaknesses. Ansible works on more of a push model where you fire it up at a point in time to execute a set or series of tasks on a host or on groups of hosts. And so this works really well for managing the application environment, which we touch much more frequently because we're making lots of changes to it. We need to do upgrades. We need events to occur on different sets of systems in a given sequence of time. And so having that, having Ansible fire that up for us we found to be the best way to manage that. We track all this using a system called Foreman. Foreman is basically a web GUI on top of a Postgres database that also sort of sits on top of Puppet. And it sort of runs your internal infrastructure for you. Like it manages DNS zone files internally. It manages your DHCP server internally. It manages your Pixie Boot environment internally. And so we kind of use this to keep track of everything and push out new hosts, new VMs. We can kind of go into Foreman and say, create me a VM on this machine with these specs. But most of this happens in kind of an automated fashion. So we can buy a new server, take it down, rack it in the data center, plug it in and power it on. And it'll come up in our environment. It'll get sort of a base image that inventories the system and sticks it into Foreman. And then Foreman, based on the hardware inventory of the system, can determine, oh, if the node has this hardware, we've spec'd it out for this particular purpose. So I'll go deploy this set of stuff on it. And this is really, really nice, right? When you want to replace a host, you want to buy new hardware. It's really, really easy to do that because we've invested in this tool chain. And then finally, we have to monitor this whole environment and make sure it works. So I mentioned earlier, we use Nagios. Global NOC runs something called Alertmon, which is sort of like a centralized collector of alerts from multiple Nagios instances. So there's lots of Nagios instances across IU, and they all have the ability to send alerts into this Alertmon system, which then ties into the IU ticketing system. We use ServiceNow. And gives us like the big display that the operations center folks see when they sit and an alarm comes up. Well, when they sit during normal times, right now they're all at home, but they'll see an alert come up, they'll triage that alert, and then they'll escalate it to engineering as needed. So if something breaks in our environment at 2 a.m., these are the guys who look at it and say, oh, do we actually need to engage someone from the operations team? Is this an issue that can wait till the next morning? That kind of stuff. In addition to this monitoring, we also have our dedicated management Elastic cluster. So we sort of dog food our own systems here in that the same tooling that we're using to watch our member environments, we're using to watch our own environment. And so we collect all the sort of useful metrics and logs that you would want to collect from any set of Linux systems and pump it into our own internal Elastic cluster to do our own monitoring, our own investigations on our own systems. So the way this sort of looks in a diagram form, the way this architecture works is which I'll go into detail on all these parts in a minute, but this is just a nice overview, is if we start in the member network, we've got, say, multiple sources of log data, and those could be just about anything, right? It could be a network intrusion detection system. It could be NetFlow records. It could be DNS query logs, Windows event logs, all that kind of stuff. It goes into, it's either scooped up by an Elastic product called Beats, which are sort of dedicated log shipper processes for different log types. Or if there isn't something that they have a dedicated log shipper for, there's Logstash, which is a very, very full-featured, just like ETL system, right? Like it is one way to think of it is it can take a number of inputs from more things than I could count. It can perform any kind of operations on that data as it comes in and then output it into a variety of formats on the other side. And so like that's sort of the Swiss Army knife of log processing and ingesting. We collect all that stuff at the member site, and we put it into a Kafka cluster that we sort of deploy on the member environment, either by shipping them hardware, or maybe they'll spin up VMs for us, depending on the case. We use that as our central collection point for all the logs in their environment. And so Kafka is basically a distributed queuing system, is sort of the way to think about it. And this serves as that store and forward buffer that has been mentioned by a couple different people in other talks. And the nice thing about this is we have this one touch point that we have to connect to pull logs from. So we're not asking people to send us logs from 25 different systems. They're sending all those into this one collection point, and we're picking up from there. And then that collection point has this buffer. So in the event that the tunnel back to our network falls down, because we all know the network isn't 100% reliable, we don't have to go back to the member and say, hey, you know, this UDP log feed dropped or whatever. All that data is sitting in the Kafka queue, and we know where we left off, and we can pick up where we left off and just ingest the backlog until we catch up. So then stuff comes over into our network, where it's processed by Logstash workers here that are doing that pulling from Kafka, doing our internal processing that I'll talk about in more detail, and then dumping it into Elasticsearch, where it is then made available to the security engineers for investigations. So that deployment that I mentioned, it starts with these aggregation servers, which is what we call them, which are the servers that we deploy on that member network. We manage these over like an IPsec VPN tunnel and SSH or HTTPS in some cases. And we like I said, we manage them remotely. We don't want our members to have to do anything about them other than, point data at them. And we have that, that buffer ability that this gives us, right? So that we can protect against outages. We can have a central point for collection. The Kafka queuing system allows, you to consume that data for multiple purposes. So we could have a set of dev systems consume that data, and then a set of production systems consume that data. And then we can make changes in the dev environment without affecting production. But everything gets tested against the same set of data. Then everything comes to those central Elastic clusters. Again, back here at IU in the Bloomington Data Center, this has also come up. We historically started out doing a cluster per member, right? Which gives you the best isolation, but it isn't always the most cost-effective or efficient way to deploy things, especially with smaller members. So as we're sort of branching out into places much, much smaller than like an R1 university, we're looking more into shared clusters to get more efficient use of our hardware and keep costs down, which keeps the cost to our members down. And so we usually keep 30 days worth of data in this sort of hot, live, searchable storage. We don't really do cold or historic storage for our members. Our sort of thesis behind this is that they're keeping their data for archival purposes, so we don't need to worry about doing that. We're keeping a month's worth of data to do investigations. And but we have sort of maintained openness to the idea of maybe branching out into longer term offsite retention for members, if that's the sort of thing that people are interested in. So we have these systems. It's just local disk, right? We're relying on Elasticsearch to provide all our data backup and replication. So like we aren't even doing RAID or anything like that in these, because Elasticsearch will shard the data in multiple places across a cluster. So you get the redundancy in the software that way. So let's talk a little bit more about our data pipeline and how we what we do with this data as it comes in. As I sort of mentioned before when I talked to the graph, the raw data gets collected on those aggregators. It gets inserted into Kafka. Then we pick it up with the Logstash instances here at IU, which is where the real work, the real data processing is done. The very first thing we do with any data set is we normalize it to an internal data schema. It started out as an internal data schema, but we've since embraced the Elastic Common Schema, which is an open standard for storing data in Elastic, so that we can sort of rely on the community there rather than trying to come up with our own data model. But we have to normalize everything to this data set because everybody's logs are different. Everybody's NIDS is different. They all use different terminology, different field names, and asking our security engineers to become familiar with the intricacies of everybody's NIDS doesn't really scale. So if we normalize everything to the same type, they learn that data format, and they can work across totally different discrete sets of data in the exact same way. Once everything's normalized, we then augment it with additional context and information before we finally put it into Elasticsearch itself. I'll talk a little bit more about that augmentation process in a few more slides. Data sources we support. So there's quite a few, right? These I would say are, this is not an exhaustive list of everything we can support, but it's probably the biggest and the most common ones that we see. These are all formats that we have existing processing pipelines written for. There are other data formats that we don't have anyone sending us today, but that the Elastic tools just support out of the box. And then at the same time, right, we have this development team. We have my team that's both operations and development. And one of the things we do is we are willing to do sort of custom development to process unusual log types for our members. And this is just part of the service package. It's not like we say, oh, this will take us 8 hours. We're going to bill you for 8 hours of dev time. Like that's just one of the things you get is we just do that for the same cost. Because our logic is we get scalability there, right? We can develop a pipeline for one member and then any other member who ever comes to us with that same type of log, we've already done the work. So it's, to our advantage to just do it. That additional augmentation and enrichments that I talked about, this is a snapshot of some of the stuff we're doing with this data in addition to just, processing it as is we do, GeoIP lookups against a GeoIP database. We, look up the ASN and populate that information into the records. When we're onboarding someone, we always sit down with the members and we talk about what are the critical parts of your infrastructure? Like where are the most important systems that you are the most concerned about? Can you give us the IP ranges to identify those? Because we'll mark them in our system for sort of special observation. If someone really, really, wants to make sure we pay attention to, say, domain controllers, right? We want to be able to identify those and do it. So getting context about the member environment is important for the security engineering team to be the most effective they can. One of the big things we've added in the last year is this idea of threat feed matching, where we in partnership with the RenISAC, are consuming their threat feeds and then matching against them in real time at ingest. So a connection record comes into our system and it's got a source IP that's on a RenISAC threat feed. We mark that and we can raise an alert, and the security engineers can say, hey, this system at this member talked to this known bad address that we know malware has been hosted on. We should look into that more. For something like Zeek logs, where we get file hashes, we can even match against a known bad list of file hashes and say, hey, this is definitely malware that we saw pass across a network. We should do something about that. Reverse DNS information can be looked up and added into this. We do a lot of caching of that. We do a lot of caching of domain information, like whois information. It's interesting to know if this is the first time a member has ever talked to a particular domain. Well, why is that? If you're talking to a domain that was registered last week, that's pretty interesting, right? Like, I mean, there might be perfectly legitimate reasons for that, but it might be suspicious, and it might be some things one wants to keep their eyes on. So this is that context that we get. One of the things we like to get is DNS query logs, because we can tie all that information together in one place. So I'll talk a bit about volume, right? So how much data are we talking about here? This is an average of our volume across all of 2020. So basically Jan 1, 2020 to Jan 1, 2021. And on average, these are the figures we did for sort of across. I'm not going to read the slide, but because that's always kind of boring. But we across all members and then across our single largest member, we have sort of a power law distribution in our data, right? Where you have sort of a few that are responsible for most of the data, and then you have a curve that slopes down at its institutional size and how much visibility they have into their network. But it gives you an idea of just how much data we're talking about. It's not a small amount at all. And the other thing I'd like to say about this data is this is averaged over a calendar year. But of course, we're talking about academia here. So data is much lower during the summer than it is during the spring. And then, of course, last year was a bit of a weird year, right? So everybody's volume was down last year. So this is actually under what we expected to do for 2020. We're sort of hoping there's a nice rebound in data volume this year, because if things start to get a little more back to normal. But once you factor that in, right, you realize that, one, this was a low year, and two, this is normal traffic averaged with summer traffic. that, you know, a typical day in a normal semester is higher than this for sure. But it's, I mean, you know, 10 billion events per day is not a small amount of records to go through. And just taking that massive amount of information and distilling it down into something that's actually useful and actionable for our members is where Scott's team comes in. And so I'm going to turn it back over to him, and he can kind of go into detail as to how that process works. But before I do that, I'll take a brief moment to see if there are any infrastructure specific questions that we want to cover. Ian, I know you've been keeping an eye on that.
Yeah, CJ, we did have a question come in. Someone asked, are you using purchased or supported versions of any of your core infrastructure tools or any log analysis tools? Is there any benefit to buying or self-supporting?
The most notable example there is Elastic itself. We are an Elastic like enterprise license, like the full bells and whistles package customer. So we get access to everything, and like all the commercial support, all the add-on features, all that kind of stuff. And it has been valuable for us. So when we started, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons we chose Elastic is that we had some internal expertise running it. But small 3-node clusters, much smaller amounts of data. We liked the tool, but we're like, well, can we go from, do we have the ability to go from, we're running this 3-node cluster by ourselves with no support, to running 500 VMs, you know, by ourselves with no support, and we didn't really like that idea. So we invested with them, and they really came in and they helped us with bring on some consultants and do the initial design. Things have changed a lot since then, but having that expertise to get started for that massive scale up that we were making, this huge jump, was really helpful. And then having their ongoing support has been good. They've been a very good partner to us. When we give them feedback about the product, I really always come away feeling that they're taking it seriously, and that they're you know, that's actually getting back to their dev team. So that's been a very good relationship for us. That's the only one of the core infrastructure tools we're using. That's really the only one that we're paying any software licensing for. If there were another I would consider doing it for, it would probably be Kafka, which is another crucial part of our infrastructure. And we have considered that, but we haven't quite jumped into doing it. Other than that, we are very open source, right? CentOS 7, you know, we're using a lot of like Puppet. We're not using the commercial Puppet. We're not using like Ansible Tower or anything like that. IU IT and the global NOC, which the OmniSOC operations team that I run kind of came out of, has a very strong open source culture. So we do definitely have that bias, but as you can see with like the big Elastic license, we're willing to purchase commercial support when we think it adds value.
Thanks, CJ.
All right, well, thank you, CJ. So what I'm going to talk about now is what we do with all that data. So, you know, CJ has talked about how we get all this information from the members, how we get it into our Elastic Stack, the enrichment that we do, the normalization, and then my team is ready to go. And we primarily focus on all the investigative parts. We have a team of security engineers that do that, but we also, while they're not truly a part of us, we're building up a team of tier 1 analysts to also take a look at certain aspects of this data as well. And so what we do is, you know, based upon a number of workflows that we have, and I'll talk more in detail what some of that workflow looks like in a moment, but we look at the data. Sometimes we'll start with the data itself and see what we find out. Sometimes we'll use external things to kind of drive that. So threat intelligence from various sources that we look at. And we also look at decisions we have made with the members on how to mitigate things. So, you know, initially when we're doing some stuff, as we're learning about their environment, we send a lot of things over, and then they will come back to us with a lot of guidance too and more information about their environment. And so there's a lot of conversation that goes back and forth. Now, in the process of our investigations, we sometimes still come to a situation is that we still have some things that we're just not sure about. There's aspects of their environment, there's some visibility that we're lacking. And so then one of the things that we'll do routinely is reach out to those members in some cases when we have those questions. You know, hey, what are the machines on this network? Here are some traffic we're seeing that thinks it looks a little bit weird. Does that make sense to you? And they'll come back to us a lot of times saying, well, you know, that's kind of this research group that's doing, you know, X, Y, and Z. That's legitimate traffic. Or sometimes if it's not, they'll provide us that information as well. And over the time, as we do our analysis, we'll come across situations that, yes, we feel that something malicious is going across there, and then we will send that to those members in the form of a ticket. Now, once we do that, our communication with them does not end there. What will then happen is that either through the ticket or we have other ways that we'll communicate with them, we will solicit feedback. Was what we sent over an actionable item? Was it a false positive? If it was a false positive, why was that? And the reason we do that is that we want to then refine our search processes so that it kind of matches out with their environments. Obviously, with an actionable item, we know those IOCs are good, and then we can use those. And when we have any of these sort of IOCs that we send over, we actually will take those and look those across all of our members. So, you know, if one member does happen to have something we hit, we do always look across all of them. And we look across all of them over a period of time. If it is a false positive, then what we can do is refine our searches. Because as I said, you know, each of the member environments is a little bit different. And so we really try to tailor our investigations to how their infrastructures are. We're not really a cookie cutter sort of operation. We're much more tailored to specific higher ed sort of missions. And one of the nice things about our operation as well is you heard CJ mention the global NOC that he came out of and his group comes part of. We are partnered with the global NOC, which is really nice because they already run a 24/7/365 operation. And so like our security analysts, we have tier 1 operations come out of that. So we have actually the ability to communicate with our members anytime, day, night, weekend, it doesn't matter. We have folks on staff and also to get requests back from them. There are occasions where members might be doing an investigation on their own and they come across something they'd like us to look to, or an external entity has contacted them about a possible, you know, compromise within their environment. These members can reach out to us and then we can work with them to kind of look at those investigations as well. So we have this 24-hour SOC that knows how to get a hold of us day or night, anytime, and we can get those eyes on glass. Hopefully, let's see if it'll come over here in a second. There we go. So what is it that we are actually looking for in these environments? And so there's a lot of indicators that help us with our analysis. And CJ kind of mentioned a few. One is that we will look at hash values. In some cases, we'll intercept files being transferred as part of the network traffic we intercept, and we can generate hash values there and compare those to items. In some cases, that might already be enriched data because the REN ISAC has already recognized some of these hashes as being possibly malicious. In other cases, we will go back to open source resources as we're looking at interesting hashes to see what are they really, have other folks reported these as being malicious. We look at IP addresses, both internal ones, are they ones that have sensitive data on there we want to keep focusing on? And we also look at the remote sites. Remote sites, do they have a history of, you know, being involved with malicious activity? Of course, we also know that a lot of times these IP addresses can change a lot that. And so one of the enrichments that CJ talked about was passive DNS. And so we will get the domain names that were associated with those requests too. And we'll look those up in these various open source intelligence platforms to see, have there been malicious activity associated with those domains? We'll also look at those domain records and maybe some key items that came out of that, some of which might be in our enrichment. How many IP addresses are associated with those particular domain names that we were looking at, and how rapidly do they change? What is the time to live, if you will, for those DNS records? Oftentimes really short ones that have a lot of IP addresses is what we refer to as fast flux IP addresses. So what it is that you make these DNS queries, those IP addresses keep changing. And that's a way that the malicious actors sometimes can hide their activity because you see all this traffic, but it's distributed across a number of systems. Sometimes by looking at the domain names, even if it's not something that has it's not immediately identifiable as being malicious, might have some really random names. It looks like it might be randomly generated through what we call a domain generation algorithm. And those will tell us maybe some things about that, particularly as we look at one of the items that CJ did mention, how new are those domains? A lot of times we call them baby domains, domains that have been created maybe within the last 3 months or less. Those, might cause us some concern. Why are these new domains, especially ones that have these really weird, long, kind of random seeming names? That might be indications of being part of a malware attack. Also, some of the things that we'll look at is for domains, were they really popular domains? Are these domains that are in these various databases that are in the top 1 million, the top 100,000, domains that are not very highly used, especially ones that maybe we've not seen before? And that might be indications of something interesting that's going on that we want to take a look at. And then finally, as we're looking at, especially a lot of the network data or a lot of the host data for things that are running on there, is there some additional metadata that's included in the records we have that we can utilize as part of our searching? So like in the case of networking, one thing that we might isolate upon are what are the web browser user agents? And that can be built into kind of our searches. At the host side, if we have endpoint detection in some cases, what was the hash of a program that was run? Is that something that's in our database as being malicious? What was the full command line that was being run? Was it a scripting language? Was it reaching out to other systems on the internet? Was a new network service started in these individual machines, especially if it's a workstation? Maybe that looks a little odd there. So, these are certain things that we can look for. In the case of Windows, was a new registry created that might be indicative of that? And so from this standpoint, we kind of start from a bottom-up sort of looking. We look at a lot of the indicators that we have within the environment, and we start to correlate those to external references that we have available to us, threat data and the like. Now, on the other side of that, we will go from the top down. Our security engineers spend a lot of time reading various blog posts, Twitter feeds, and a number of other different kind of resources that are out there that are put out by groups and by individuals who are doing a lot of threat hunting and understand and are tracking a lot of the current attack campaigns that are going out there. And so particularly what we want to learn from them, what are the tactics, the techniques, the procedures that these folks are using? A lot of times these material that we're reading include a lot of indicators, these IOCs, that we can then start searching across our environment. In fact, oftentimes, we've looked through our data for IOCs that we've gotten from these sources. They were not things picked up by resources that the individual members have, like their intrusion detection system. So we can kind of do our detections that way. And with the tactics, tactics and techniques they're using, can we identify the tools and what are the tools doing? And can we look at on the sites, are there indications that maybe some of these tools are in play there? So we have a couple different ways that we'll kind of look at the data to kind of identify malicious behavior. Now, what does that look like in a day-to-day operation? So for us, particularly our security analysts, we have them focus on the NIDS alerts, the network intrusion detection systems. What alerts are being triggered there? And specifically what we will do to kind of tailor our searches is one search that we will do right from the very beginning. Are there new NIDS alerts that we're seeing that we have not seen before, or at least have seen over the 30-day span of the data that we have? Now, there's a couple different situations that can come up that can lead us to that. One is that this was a new NIDS signature that our members have installed on their various appliances. And so, this is a new one. Typically, when you get new NIDS alerts, therefore, some very, recently occurring attacks are out there. So we'll start looking at those. Do we see the traffic that's triggering those alerts? Is it something that truly is malicious? What are those trapping on? In other cases, maybe these signatures have been in place for a little while, but maybe now there's a new tool in the wild that's trying to exploit the vulnerabilities that those NIDS alerts track upon. And so those are two different things that we'll do for new alerts that we've not seen over a period of time and focus on those. The next thing that we'll do is we'll narrow our time scope. Instead of looking at that 30-day window holistically, we'll cut it down to like the last 24 hours, the last 72 hours. And what in particular are spikes are we seeing in NIDS alerts that are being generated? What are the type of things that are going on? And as part of that, we also look at things like what was the traffic flow that triggered these alerts? A lot of cases for network alerts that are coming in, if they came in from the outside, a lot of traffic that's originated from there, we're not usually as concerned about a lot of it because a lot of it turns out to be scans. As we joke, the internet is working fine because people are trying to probe us randomly and indiscreetly, but nothing is really happening there. On the other side, however, if we see in particular a lot of alerts that are generating from traffic that's originating from the inside, that might be an indication that perhaps some of these machines have been compromised and are now taking some more malicious action. And so those are two ways that we'll look at the NIDS alerts to kind of get a view of what's happening in the environment. Beyond just looking at the NIDS data, though, we look at other IOCs that we've got, known bad as we kind of look at these. And in particular, if we've had actionable IOCs, actionable indicators that we've seen either on this member or across any of our other members, we'll look for those and continue to look for those. And so we make it a point to keep track of alerts that are issues that have happened on any of our members and track those across all of our members. Likewise, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we also are looking at our threat intelligence, and we take all of those IOCs and we start looking across all of our internal sites to see if we're seeing any indications that those indicators are present there. And we'll, in fact, we'll build a lot of filters and a lot of some dashboards that'll help us identify those over a period of time. And then once we've gone through all of that, then one last thing we'll try to do is kind of siphon out from all the noise that we can and see if there's anything interesting in what's left. If you ever have looked particularly at NIDS data, there's a lot of it, especially in the environments the sizes of some of the institutions that we monitor. And a vast majority of it is noise, not of value. So one of the things that we try to do is, can we filter out all of this traffic that we've looked at previously and have known to be good, or we thought it was kind of suspicious before and reported it, and it came back as false positives. We want to kind of ignore all of that and then look at what's left. What's left is stuff that we've never looked at before. Now, it's not to say that that's malicious traffic. In fact, a vast majority of it turns out to be good traffic. And of course, when we identify things as being good traffic, then we go right around and add that to future filters. But sometimes you'll see some new traffic or some anomalous traffic out there that we're not necessarily familiar with. It looks a little odd and turns out to be malicious. And this is a part of our efforts to really get to know our member environments and what's really going on there. Now, beyond the day-to-day operations, we also will do deeper hunting. Our security engineers in particular will just tunnel down deep into the data and to see if we find some other things that may be hidden in the mix. This is one of those big data sort of problems here. We have such a huge volume of stuff here that's very easy for things to go undetected. And so some ways that we help to kind of tease out those needles in the haystack, if you will, one is what we call long tail analysis. So I mentioned in those IOCs, we try to capture a lot of that metadata. And again, I'll use the example of a browser user agent. So we assume that most institutions are using a lot of the common browsers. So let's say Chrome or Safari or Microsoft Edge or Brave or any of the number of these really popular ones. We assume that a lot of folks are using those, and we'll ignore those. Instead, what we'll focus on are what browser user strings for, let's say, connections from the inside going out do we not see very often, very rare, maybe only a few workstations and the entire environment are using. Those might be curious. Sometimes those are automated scripts that are going out and pulling web pages, perhaps a part of an attack. Sometimes there's malicious software out there and they're trying to spoof the web browsers, but they haven't done a perfect job to completely duplicating those user strings that are used by those common browsers. And so we can utilize that data, those low frequency occurring events, to indicate something that's out of the ordinary. And again, that's really what we're looking for in the deep hunting. What is out of the ordinary? What are the anomalies that we're detecting? And kind of along that same example I was just giving you with the browser user agents, one of the things we do is we look for what we call command and control, or C2 beaconing. A lot of malware, once they infect a workstation, one of the things that they'll do is they'll periodically call home. That call home might come every hour, every 2 hours, maybe every day, but it kind of calls home to see if the home station has some new software for them to download to further some attacks, or perhaps even to launch certain types of attacks. Well, these communications are often very, very small, and it's very easy for those to get lost. But we have a program, it's called Flare. In fact, CJ's platform engineers actually rewrote it to meet some performance concerns that we had. They actually will look through the whole data holistically, all of our network traffic for these sort of communication sessions, to try to identify some of these periodic sessions that are going out there, and then make those available for our security engineers to look at and say, you know, was that remote site a malicious site that is trying to go to? What information is being passed? What is this local system that's coming out? Now, and to be honest with you, a lot of times it's legitimate traffic. Before I came over to the OmniSOC, you know, I was a IT manager for a school of science here, part of the IU system. And we discovered there was a lot of beaconing. And as we did our investigation, it turned out to be our backup software system that was periodically calling back to the vendor, giving stats on tape qualities and all that. It was, you know, legitimate type of traffic there. It wasn't malicious in nature. So you'll do see a lot of beaconing that. In my home network, I see a lot of that. I see as an example, my Chromecast constantly contacting a system in Google to make sure that there's good network connectivity. But in other cases, it could be malicious software. Now, another thing that we want to even look a lot more on is machine learning. We've done a little bit with it already. We worked with an external research institution to kind of help them test some of the algorithms they had for machine learning for looking for groups of malicious activity based upon NIDS alerts. So we gave them access to what we call sanitized versions of data. So there was nothing really identifiable to individual machines in our environment. And they use that to kind of look through our data to see if they can find clusters of bad operations in there or indications of a malicious attack. That was our first kind of jump in there. If you went yesterday to the Elastic talk, they talked about a lot of things that they're now having available with the newest version of their software. You know, they have a lot of new machine learning concepts that as we're finishing our upgrades, that we're going to be utilizing a lot more in our environment to help identify other things that are just deviations from what's normal. Again, these aren't things that are necessarily going to be malicious, but it's something that someone we want to take a look at to verify. Now, we have all this data. We start looking through our data, our engineers do, and we see something that doesn't look quite right. So what our event analysis process looks like is something like this. And I kind of borrowed this from General Colin Powell's book. He said it worked for me because he used it to describe how he was processing threat intelligence. And I realized when I read that, that was exactly the process we did without articulating as such. But the big question you first ask is, all right, we see this malicious behavior, what do we know? And part of that, what do we know, is what other sources of log data that we have from that particular member that can help us provide some more insight. So if this was a NIDS alert, we might go to NetFlow. We might go to some other decoders we have for various applications and say, all right, what more can we find out? And we take that as far as we can. Now we get to a certain point after we looked at all the data that we have collected internally, we start asking ourselves, all right, what still don't we know? And can we get those answers? Now, sometimes that answer comes in the form of going to these open source threat intelligence sites, and they have, we can provide a hash value in, or these IP addresses, or these domains, and we can get some more information about those items to kind of help us refine our investigation. Sometimes even that's not a lot of help, and sometimes, especially if it involves internal machines, that we're have some questions about, we can reach out to our members that I talked about before and maybe get some information about what those machines are, what sort of things do they do to communicate to the outside. Maybe that provides us some clue of whether this traffic is legitimate or not. Now, once we've done this to the best of our ability, we've answered the questions as deeply as we can, we start then looking at, all right, what do we really think happened? Sometimes we get what we call golden nuggets. Golden nuggets are, we see these IOCs, we immediately know that, yes, this is bad action. We need to be able to take some, we need to do something about this. Or the other side is, okay, if I see these or these machines are involved, this is okay. We can immediately discard that as not being an issue we have to worry about it at all. Oftentimes, however, we're not very lucky. We don't get those golden nugget sorts of identifiers. And so we have to rely on other aspects. One is our prior experience. Is, oh, well, we've seen this sort of behavior before in other cases, and they prove to be actionable as an example. So we might be able to use that. Sometimes it's just not very clear at all. It's really fuzzy. And we might just look at it and kind of go with our gut and say, this just looks weird. And especially in cases like that, what was very common in our team is that whoever's doing that investigation will reach out to the rest of us and say, hey, I'm looking at this, and they'll provide like some information to the dashboard they're looking at, which filters that are in play for what the data is they're focusing on, and say, What do you think? And we'll talk about it in-house to say, is this something that we think is actionable, or do we think is this something that's okay, or is it something that we want to watch? And then we get to the point when we've done this to the best of our abilities, we've got to make a decision. Is it something that's reportable? Is it something that's not reportable? And so we got to make that sort of decision. And in some cases, we can't, we don't really know either way. And we'll add those what we call a watch list. So we see some stuff there that we think might be bad, but we can't verify, but we can't immediately discount it either. And so we'll put it on a watch list so that we can keep an eye on that traffic in the future to see if we get some more insight later on, if this activity continues. Now, in the case of things that are actionable, what we will do then is we'll also assign a confidence level to that, a high, a medium, or a low, so that our individual members kind of know, how we felt about our analysis. Do we feel like we really were, very confident in it, or this is one of those that's kind of on the edge, and they can use that to set their expectations. Now, I have to be honest with you, especially the first time, and this is definitely the first times for me when I found stuff, this is what it felt like when you came across something and said, yes, this is something that's reportable, this is something that is actionable. Hit the red button, fire off the ticket, let's get this thing going. And for this, what that fire off looks like is we have a template that we fill out. So we have a, kind of in the subject, we kind of give that real quick one-liner summary of what we saw. This is the type of alerts that we saw, or this type of voter, exploit that we're seeing going on. And here are the machines that are being affected. And then inside of that ticket, there are all the details we provide them. So the incident results, what are the results of what we found? What do we think that we saw was really going on? How did we classify that particular sort of event? And in particular, then we'll let them know is in their logs, where did we find all of these indicators? And we'll identify each of those logs, and along with that, what time frame for them to look for. And so this gives them the ability, as when they get this ticket, they too, with their tools, which may be very different than ours, they can look through those same logs, look at the data that we've identified as those IOCs over that window of time, and do their own investigation. And sometimes they have, even information that we don't have from other log sources. The criteria is the whole narrative for us. And so what we do is we define, okay, we saw this led us to look at X, Y, and Z. This is kind of the criteria. We provide that entire narrative of the search that we were doing in their environment. And we provide obviously the dates timestamp that we actually are submitting this report, the confidence level I've already mentioned before, and then we also give them a kind of a recommendation, if they verify that this is malicious activity, here are some things that we make a suggestion for you to do. These are the reasons why. And then of course, the last thing that we'll include with our ticket is while we have the generic email address we use that, for responding back to tickets, we also include our IU identifier so that if the member comes back and has questions or want us to do further research, our tier 1 folks who get these tickets back, that 24/7 operation, they know which engineer worked on it and can redirect those questions there so we can continue our analysis with them. Now, that is not the only way that we interact with our members. Another way that we interact with them is every member site we've created an email list that has all of their security team members they've identified on that, as well as all of ours. One place that we use that for routinely is, CJ's team, when they're doing maintenance on aspects of the cluster, they'll send it out to those members. Where we use it, amongst other things, is that we will send out a monthly hunt summary. This is sort of a report where we talk about all the different things that we saw over that 1 month period of time, things that we have escalated and have found to be actionable. Now we sanitize that. So we don't say, oh, member X had this sort of vulnerability. We keep it in very general terms where several members had this sort of attack occurring on them. We also will provide additional links and follow-up material for certain attacks as we have those available. So we can use this kind of, so all the members know the types of attacks we're seeing and what those attacks were. We also meet with our members bi-weekly over Zoom. This is a time that, like our platform engineers, they can talk about the different changes that are going on or issues they're working for, new things that they're doing on their side. On the security engineering side, our side, what we can do is talk about those tickets that we've recently reported and kind of go over those, solicit feedback. Was it an actionable ticket? Was it a false positive? If it was a false positive, why? Again, we can utilize all this information to kind of further refine the IOCs we're seeing, whether things that we want to continue looking for or things that we can enter into an allow list and ignore in the future. Now, sometimes, I mentioned this much earlier, we can also work with them in a joint investigation. If they reach out to us for our help in investigating something that they're looking at, we'll use a Zoom conference to have that sort of collaboration and joint investigation sort of discussions. Now, for more interactive on-the-fly chats, we also use Slack. We have a Slack channel for every member too that we invite them to join. And so if we have things for them, they have things for us, we can have interactive kind of text-based conversations there. We can share info. And then finally, the last thing that we kind of share out with them if they'd like to use it is our hunt journals. A hunt journal is a fancy way for us of saying it is a Google Doc for each member that we start writing as we are doing an analysis, an engineer or analysis doing their work, that we put a lot of our notes out there. A lot of times this includes a lot of things that we don't end up reporting. We've discounted for one things, but these are things that we put out there, you know, what sources, destination addresses, what was it doing, and it's deep down in that investigation process that we have. We like to invite our members to see their, you know, the hunt journals for their environment and invite them to look at it to, you know, to understand, for one, what we're looking at, how we're looking at it, but also they can also, if they want to, is they can provide some additional context. In fact, one member in particular used to be really great about this. They would look through the hunt journal and they'd see some things that we didn't report. And we give some reasons why we thought it wasn't reportable, and they would provide lots of context. Oh, this block of machines in this network are doing these things. That's perfectly legitimate. Here's why. And that's great feedback for us, and it helps us, again, to get to know their environments better. Now, this is an anniversary celebration, and so with all anniversaries, it becomes a time of reflection for us. And so as I was thinking about this, I was looking about, you know, where we've come from, where we are now, where we're going. And, you know, this slide, which actually came from a talk that Elastic gave a year ago, and I have the link for it there. I think you folks are going to be getting a copy of the slides. It's a good presentation to watch. It's kind of a good model or description of where we've been. When we first got started, we first went live with our first member in February of 2018. We're in that left bottom quadrant, and this graph is looking at the visibilities that we need to be able to do things and the scalability of the threats that we were able to address. Back when we first got started, there weren't a lot of things that we were able to look at. We were driven just solely by NIDS alerts. We only had a small subset of data, and our investigations were very focused but very limited. But as we grew, we got some more data sources in, our skill sets grew, we understood the environments a lot more. We started looking at a lot of these external threat intelligence sites and gleaming out IOCs from them. We were able to take that step a lot further. Today, we're in this third box, this sort of grapefruit colored box here. Is one thing that we have found is that while we all do a lot of hunting, we also have our own ways of doing that, which is sometimes always hard when you're teaching new folks coming in, new analysts, new engineers. And so one of the things that we're focusing on more now is really standardizing and documenting our processes. We're also working very closely with our members. What other data do you have out there that we can collect? What other sources can we get from them to build new hunts for new detections? And we're really driven by what is going on out there in the industry. What are some of the attacks out there? What are techniques that we can utilize? One of the things we reference heavily is the MITRE attack framework. And we might isolate certain attacks in there that we're starting to see. And what things can we learn from that framework? What visibility can we gain so we can do even more advanced hunting across that? And then where we hope to be in the future, we're working towards that pinkish purple area there and doing a lot more automated detections and the like, so we can really amp up things. And if you watched the Elastic presentation yesterday, they're already now starting to build up their own tools to kind of assist us with that. So with this in mind, what do we have coming up over the next year in particular? What our focuses are for new capabilities? One is endpoint analytics and analysis. Largely everything that we've been doing up to this point has been focused heavily on the networking side. Now, one problem that we're starting to see is that there are changes coming down the line that's going to start limiting our availability or our visibility there. One example is that TLS 1.3 is coming in, and we're not going to be able to see, in some cases, even information about the certificates. We're also starting to see a move to do DNS queries over HTTPS. And of course, DNS queries for us is like gold because that's sort of the snapshot of what's going to come next. And losing that insight is going to hurt us a little bit from some of the detections that we currently are using. What can we do to improve that? We can get endpoint data and do a lot more with that. In fact, we've got one member who's already doing some endpoint stuff already. They're starting to send us their logs. And then in that talk yesterday, one of the new things that's been added to the Elastic suite of options is their endpoint security product. And so we can put agents on a lot of their core systems, collect that endpoint data there, and then build detections based upon that. In addition, we want to do a lot of automated detections, and Elastic is now building some tools to assist with that. We were playing with some external tools and had limited success with those, but with these tools, what we hope to do is build, in one case, some high fidelity, high impact event alerting, some things that we know if we see these things and they know they're really they're bad and have to be acted on immediately, that we can make those alertings automatic. We see those things automatically, then a ticket's going to get fired off to the members anytime 24/7 that they can then be able to act upon. Also, as we are starting to now build up our tier 1 analysts, one problem if you've ever looked, especially at NIDS data, there's a lot of noise there. Can we streamline that a bit? Can we keep them from going down a lot of rabbit holes, give them the data they need and not the data that's going to lead them down the wrong paths? And so that is one thing that we're looking on with automated detections. Machine learning, I already talked a little bit about that earlier on. We had we kind of dipped our toes into the machine learning pool, and we wanted, we felt like the water is great. We want to do a lot more of that. And Elastic has added a lot of things that as we finish some upgrades that we're doing now with their normalizations, we're going to be able to really take advantage of this. And then lastly, some of the things that we're working on is, if you remember that slide I showed, that showed the kind of block diagram of how OmniSOC operates, one of the things I did not really talk about that was this automated mitigation everywhere. And that's something that we've been thinking about a lot. And if you were at the CIO talk previous to this, they were talking about this. And this is a pilot that they're starting to work on with us. Can we create a curated threat sharing platform that we can share that data easily to all of our members, that through some APIs, they can query that platform and immediately take those IOCs and put that into their security devices, their border routers, their firewalls, their network detection and prevention systems. And the IOCs that we look to be putting in there, in some cases, is right what we talked about before, those IOCs from actionable events, not only from their site, but from any of the sites that we are managing. And also, one other thing we can look at is some of these members are starting to put honeypots in their environment. If you went to the Ren ISAC talk yesterday, you might have heard them talk about the Duke Stinger honeypot. We have some members who are deploying that. And so with that, then what we can do, oops, we got moved across a little bit. Let me jump up 1 second if I can. Come on. Oops. There we go. We can, take anything there. Anything that touches those machines should not be looked at. So we want to react to those aware. And then finally, while these Google Docs for our hunt journals has been good, it's also a little cumbersome. So we're looking at a shared case management platform, particularly we're looking at the Hive, that not only we can use to put all of our analysis work in there for cases that we start working, but grant our members access to that so they can see the things that we're looking at. These tools have automated configuration to go out to open source things and do some of that evaluation for us. And with that, and I know I'm starting to run a little late here, I apologize. What questions do you have? Ian, anybody out there have any questions for us?
Scott, in the interest of time, we've been Rob and I have been answering a couple questions.
Fantastic, thank you.
In line, so we've been handling it through the chat interface a little bit.
Well, great.
I don't think there's anything new that's come up specifically. We had a couple questions about our NDA and the access into the information we have, and what students might have visibility into.
Okay.
There's a new question that did just come in though. How often is a 30-day retention window a limitation during hunting and triage?
For us, most of the time that it hasn't been, because we are looking at the data continually. I'm sure there are some hunts where it would be really nice to be able to go way back to see if certain things are going on, especially as, certainly things like, let's say the solar wind stuff, if that thing has been available for a long time, how far back can we kind of do these sort of detections? But it hasn't really played a factor for us yet. That may change in the future. Well, if there are no other questions, certainly I encourage you to contact us. Here are CJ's and my direct email addresses, or an email address you can get to our centralized team in general, and a phone number to get generalized. We love talking about this. We love working on this sort of stuff. So feel free, anytime you have questions, reach out to us. We'd love to chat with you about it. And with that, I'll thank you very much, especially for your patience. If we have run over a few minutes, I believe this is the last session for today.